everyone. First, I just want to say a big thank you to Food Tank for putting together this really inspiring day, and thank you all for being here. It's absolutely an honor to be joined by this amazing panel. We are here to talk about solving the problem of food loss and food waste that happens on farms. So I wanted to start us off with a working definition of on-farm food loss so that we're all on the same page. So we're going to be talking about edible food that is either not being harvested or is lost between harvest and sale. So our panel will be speaking about the loss that happens on the farm where the food is grown pre and post-harvest. And this is going to include losses related to storage and packaging that take place on the farm as well. And this is also going to include food that is grown with the intention of feeding humans that is then diverted to other purposes, such as animal feed or compost. And our discussion today is going to be focused first on defining the problem of on-farm food loss, but we're going to try to spend the majority of our time really focused on solutions and practical ways that we can reduce this issue. And so to put the discussion in context, you all have detailed bios for the panelists in your program, but I've asked everybody to respond very quickly, 1-minute answers, please, to our first question to give you context on how these panelists interact with this issue in their professional lives, and also because I think it's really inspiring to see all of the different careers that can be tied to this issue. And so let's begin with Rafael. And I'd like to ask you to please briefly describe how you encounter on-farm food loss and address the causes of it in your professional role.
Thank you. As you know, the foundation has a very long history of engaging in food. And a couple of years ago, we started up an initiative called YieldWise, which is being wise about the yield, all the food that we produce. And as part of that effort, we started to engage in 4 catalytic demonstrations, looking at what are the main causes and how we can prevent food loss in mango, maize, tomato, and cassava. And it has been very interesting to see that with very tangible solutions like hermetic bags or crates, or simply getting the logistics piece sorted out, you can drastically reduce food loss from the farm to the fork.
Thank you. And next we have Marie Haga.
Let me start out with this morning and Dan Barber, because we heard him speak enthusiastically this morning about breeding, how we can develop crops that give high yields, that are nutritious and also delicious. In order to do this, what you have to base yourself on is the diversity within crops. So if you want to develop a potato that can fight a new disease, you would want to have access to all the 4,500 varieties of potatoes that exist around the globe. If you work on wheat, you want to have access to all the 125,000 varieties of wheat that exist around the globe. What should be of concern to Dan Barber and all of us, and which is awfully important also for food waste on farm, is that we have lost a tremendous amount of diversity. For many of the crops, we have lost 80%. If we speak about fruits and vegetables in the US, you have probably lost more than 90% of those. And for each variety we lose options to fight diseases, to develop plants that can stand stormy weather, more unpredictable weather, and we can speak more about this afterwards. But what we do in the Crop Trust is then to safeguard the diversity of these crops around the globe so we can use it to breed the plants that we need for whatever purpose it is.
Thank you. Next we have Tobias Grasso.
Good afternoon, everyone. Great to be here. I'm very proud to be associated with Sealed Air and work with my colleagues every day with food companies and retailers around the globe, pursuing opportunities to reduce food waste and loss across the entire chain, from farm to consumers. We can do this, and we do this every day through better technology, better protection of food in general. We can bring food to our tables that are fresher, that are more tasteful, that are safer, and they're more economical as well. Now, in CUBOT, we partner with several institutions to talk about this issue, because we believe that it's the network that working together is powerful than any individual component. The Rockefeller Foundation, we work together with you. WWF, Future Farmers of America, to name just a few of those institutions. I'm originally from Brazil. I just moved to the US 3 weeks ago. I come from a country where there's ample of food production and production that feeds the world.
Right.
Now, at the same time, it's a land of contrast, because we have poverty still, and we have hunger. So it's not about having food close to consumers. That's the only solution. In my career, I manage farms as well. So I can relate to farmers, and I admire the farmers so much for their resilience. And when you see food lost at the farm level, it's the worst thing that can happen for anyone. So I'm sure we'll talk more about it. I'm glad to be here again.
Thank you, Tobias. And next up, Beth Mitchum.
Hi, pleasure to be here. So my work at the University of California, my career there actually began in 1992. And since then, I've worked really closely with the US produce industry on issues related to produce handling. So doing research and also extending information to try to help maintain quality, safety, and reduce losses. And in 2009, I became the director of the Horticulture Innovation Lab, which is a program that's focused on the developing countries. And in that program, we're trying to promote fruit and vegetable production, and also looking at post-harvest handling, which is a big challenge in many places. I think one of the biggest challenges in terms of produce loss or food loss is the connection that farmers have with their market. It's an issue sometimes in the United States in terms of trying to meet market standards, whether they're related to quality or safety. That can sometimes lead to loss. And in the developing world, oftentimes farmers don't have the confidence that the market's going to pay them for doing a better job, for investing in better ways of doing things.
Thank you. Dr. Jain Ambika.
Oh, good afternoon, everyone. Just like Beth, I'm also from the University of Nairobi. I'm the head of horticulture. And most of what I do is, of course, as a university, we teach, but we also do research. But as far as issues post-harvest is concerned, we currently focusing on adaptive research, finding innovations, technologies that are appropriate and applicable for smallholder farmers in Africa. So after several years of research in the lab and on station, we're now trying to get these technologies out to the farmers. And this we're doing with the support from development partners like the Rockefeller Foundation, USAID. So I think we'll talk about this later, that we are now trying to address the issue practically, because it's not that we don't have technologies to address the losses of the farm, but how do farmers access these technologies, especially smallholder farmers who have limited resources. So technologies are there, but how do we make them accessible and affordable for the smallholder farmers in Africa?
Thank you, Jane. And last but not least, Jack Algiere.
Well, thank you. Grateful to be here with this bright group. What we do at Stone Barns, it's just a little bit north of here, about 30 miles, is really focus on the direct market, on the community involvement. So imagine, really when I think about this issue of waste and on-farm use, building a language, building a cultural relationship and understanding about the food system so that people understand what they're using, that we are increasing the diversity of things that we're growing, both genetically and also the people and the markets and the things that we're working internally, that community. And then, of course, the cycles that we have in place, that we're building agricultural systems that are using products, recycling systems, putting them back in, and really making a creative and energetic system. And we're hoping that if we step back on the sort of community level, then that will be a fractal for all the cities and continue to build that relationship.
Thank you. So I think what's so great about this panel is we have a lot of different perspectives. We have international perspectives, and we also have perspectives on this issue of on-farm food loss, both pre and post-harvest. So I'd like to get into that a little bit more, and also to begin thinking about the issue of on-farm food loss as an economic issue, but also an environmental and a social issue. So I'm going to narrow down a little bit on some of those questions. And Rafael, I'd like to direct this question to you of how specifically does on-farm food loss contribute to global food insecurity?
Well, if you think about the African continent, the African continent imports $40 billion of grain every single year. Yet, we have losses of 30–40% on the farm. If we think about, an import substitution agenda, you could argue that that's the first place to start. Why to invest more resources and more expensive land and inputs into food that you're already producing, but you cannot save? So from that perspective, I think it's really important. We got a couple of weeks ago some early results from Tanzania that indicate that reducing food loss gives an extra income of 30%, extra revenue of 30% among smallholder farmers, and increases the food security of those farmers by 30%, and 40% among women. So think about the impact of just getting that piece solved. Now, if you add the climate agenda, which we all care about, there is no way that we will reach the Paris Accord without solving this issue. There is no way. Now, if you think about another agenda, which is very dear to us as a foundation in terms of increasing availability of nutritious foods, that also correlates to this agenda. As we think about the investments in infrastructure, and thinking about the food that we need to consume in the future, we need to gear those investments towards more fruits, vegetables, and more nutrient-rich foods. So all these agendas come together with this issue.
And I'd like to come back to you a little later if we have time to talk more about investing in this issue, because I think that's something we could spend a lot of time on when we get to the solutions part. But another thing I wanted us to be thinking about as we're going into that is, and I'll turn to you, Jack, is I'd like us to have a quick discussion about the environmental impacts that come downstream of on-farm food loss. So what happens if we have crops rotting in the field, or what happens if we're discarding large amounts of food, or perhaps leading to soil issues or things down the road?
Well, I think what you're getting towards is this concept of this sort of false siloing of crops and on monocultural scales. When we're not having diversified systems that are linked directly to communities that have an end use, then of course there's going to be waste in those, significant waste in those systems. There are a lot of things that will play into that. I mean, right now with all the immigration issues that we're having, and the fact that this country is really run by migratory workers that are picking. Lots of farmers are not having their crops picked after they've done all this work because they can't find anyone to do it. So these kind of systems, there are big cycles in play that are sort of fundamentally upside down. But diversified systems can actually organize these things so that they are, the service is to the soil, the service is to developing the land over time, sort of a long game. Of course, it's in the planning process of being able to get that food to people, and a community effort, maybe not just the distributor's decision to take it or leave it, that everyone needs to be involved in that process. So communication and all of the other industries that are engaged in that to be together at the table to solve that problem.
So on the note of the economic pressures that are a leading cause of the on-farm food loss in the first place, Beth, I'd like to turn to you and ask if you could describe some of those economic pressures that lead to this sort of a loss. And I think we hear a lot about economic circumstances where it's not cost effective for farmers to actually harvest their crops. So could you give us some background on that?
Certainly. Well, one of the big issues that plays into that are the grade standards that we have in the United States and in many parts of the world. I believe the grade standards play an important role in having a well-functioning market system so that there's a way of communicating about products you're selling and products you're buying. So I don't think they should be done away with, but unfortunately, some of the standards, well, for many crops, there are standards based on appearance, quality, and size that may have little to do with the nutritional quality or the eating quality of that product. And so a couple of examples I can think of, I remember being in a field with a peach grower, and they had already picked the trees, but there were quite a lot of fruit left on the tree, which we were all enjoying. And we asked him, so when are you going to pick the rest of these? And he said, well, these don't have enough red color, and therefore the market isn't going to pay us enough to make it economically worthwhile for us to pick them. Now, hopefully he's going to turn to some other opportunity to have that fruit gleaned off, but it's one reason why things don't enter normal market channels. Another example, we had our post-harvest technology short course group out in the field visiting cauliflower production, and we were looking at all the cauliflower that was left behind after the pickers went through, and the grower picked up one and said, this is too yellow. And I could barely see any yellow on it, but it just had enough of a hue of yellow that she felt she really couldn't market it to her buyers. So we heard earlier today about how we just need to change the conversation. I mean, we as consumers are part of the issue. I know I'm guilty myself. I know, even though I know red color is not associated with eating quality, when I go to the store, I still find myself grabbing the redder product. So we all have to train ourselves to think about this differently, and then hopefully if the retailers and the buyers get that message, then it can eventually change.
And I have to ask, do you think that, I'm going to call it a trend, I think it's a trend of embracing sort of the ugly heirloom tomatoes and the ugly produce. It's something that's seeing some pickup, but do you think that's effective at reducing on-farm food loss at scale?
That's a good question. I mean, there certainly is a trend towards the heirlooms, and people can really recognize those, and they're willing to forgive all sorts of imperfections. I know there are groups that have tried the imperfect fruit and the ugly fruit. Rayleigh's in California had a big program with the ugly fruit. And I guess my understanding is that they had to do away with it because they couldn't get enough product. And I have to believe that that's a logistics issue where the system just wasn't in place to get that product to them, because I know it's out there. So that, unfortunately, maybe it was too far ahead of its time, and maybe the time has come back now. So I think just people accepting the heirlooms, it shows that they're open to those kind of things. And so if we can just try to push that needle a little bit further with some other, the more common crops that they eat, I think we might be able to get there.
Can I make a comment
Of
about
course.
this? You touch on very important points, and I think the solutions are in the connection of the entire chain. I don't think the farmer alone is going to do anything, the retailer alone is going to do anything. It's going to require the network to work. And I've seen many cases where there are solutions, whether it's ugly fruit that starts at the retail level, but you can also talk to transporters, logistics operators, processors, and be creative about looking at the food loss that happens at the farm level, understand the components of that chain, and create a streamlined solution just for that piece. I've seen that happening in avocados. I've seen that happening in pineapple. I've seen it in many other crops. Fruits, as we talk about, is more than 40% food waste and loss. So I think there are ways to do it, but it does require everyone to be engaged.
So I would like to take Tobias's response, which is to say that it's no one individual's responsibility or no one farmer's responsibility to change our minds on ugly produce or reworking the way that we think about food loss on farms. I would like to turn to Marie and Tobias. You may want to weigh in on this also, about ultimately whose responsibility is it to reduce on-farm food loss and waste?
Well, it certainly is the responsibility for basically all of us in the end. But I think it is important to focus actually on the farm because there is also so much that farmers can do with a little bit of help. And one very important source for food loss on farm is pest and disease. We can, of course, breed plants that are resistant to pests and diseases. We've done that for many crops and many diseases, and we just need to do more of it. We really need to develop plants that can delay post-harvest deterioration. We have a very recent example from cassava, where we have done crossings with regular cassava and what is called a crop wild relative of cassava, a distant cousin of the cassava that we use most of the time. And through these crossings, one has come up with a cassava that can stay fresh for much, much longer. We can take other examples. One of the things we really need to deal with now is, of course, climate change, as we touched upon to begin with. Farmers have to deal with a much rougher weather, a more unpredictable weather, more storms, more heavier rain, etc., etc. And it's going to be important, for example, to develop plants then that have stronger root systems. We rescued a while ago something called the Bermuda bean. There were 29 plants left on, you can guess where, Bermuda. These were rescued, and these plants have this unique root system. And of course, if you cross that with regular beans, you develop a plant that is much stronger, that can stand weather in a very different ways. So it's amazing what we can do if we base ourselves on nature itself and just give it a little bit of help. And in terms of responsibility, of course, governments have a great responsibility for example, safeguarding the diversity of crops around the world. I think the private sector should contribute as well, but this is a global common good, and clearly governments should take their part of the responsibility. Farmers will have to pick up. We have to make sure that farmers are trained. There are so many ways each of us can contribute in this context.
Yeah. I think here also we have to realize that we built a food system based on different needs in the past. We were trying to feed a growing population. It's still the case, but now we have a lot more pressure in terms of resources and biodiversity. And I think having the discussion here at the university is the right place because we need the new generations to help address the issues of the past that we created. And we as a foundation also made mistakes in terms of those investments. A group of 20 crops, a group of high yields that provided a huge economic return. But these days we need to care about other issues in addition to those. Mm-hmm. And we need to care about nutrition, we need to care about the environment, we need to care about biodiversity. And we require a different food system altogether. And I think as we think about addressing the issue of food loss and food waste, we have to also put that into perspective.
Can I make a comment about the role of governments? You mentioned whose responsibility is it at the end. I can give you an example. We partnered with WWF as an example in China to understand about the poultry value chain. 80% of all the chicken that's consumed in China is unpacked. Now, the Chinese government is worried about food safety and food security as well. Mm-hmm. So the consumption of chicken in China has doubled over the last 10 years. So it's a pressing topic. With WWF, we conduct an extensive survey and analysis of that chain. Now, to produce one chicken, you need about 20 liters of water. You need 4 kilograms or about 9 pounds of feed. To produce the 9 pounds of feed, you need about 8 square meters of land. It's a lot of resources. And of all chicken that's consumed in China, about 20% is lost or wasted. About 3% of that happens at the production level with the farmer. Now, throughout this survey, we found out that if we can collectively work towards better protected chicken that's now going to wet market and is wasted so much, we can now have a system from farm to consumers in a packaged way, in a safer way. There's a transition that's going to happen. It's going to take time, but you see the government involved, you see all the players involved as well. So that's why I mentioned it requires a collective effort, and doing studies like this, taking WWF and connecting with them to do this work with us was just a great experience.
And I do think that also consumers are extremely important in this context. I think we should realize that we more or less have a broken food system. You know, when 800 million of us go to bed hungry, 600 million are obese, we waste 30% of our food and 30% of our soil is degraded, then something is fundamentally wrong. And that is certainly a topic for top political level. But I think nothing will happen at that top political level unless we get consumers involved. And that you demand food that is good for you, that's good for the farmers, and that is good for the planet. I think that's really where the change is going to come.
Yeah. And Beth, I'll come back to you. Jain, I want to ask you if you can talk a little bit about differences in the way that on-farm food loss happens based on the regional economics and the type and scale of the farms and some of the solutions that you're working on to address on-farm food loss.
Okay, so I think in the morning, Roy Steiner from Rockefeller Foundation tipped us on that when it comes to the developing countries, a lot of the losses happen from production after harvest all the way to the retail. And most of this is because of practices, lack of technology, things that mostly the farmers, okay, they could do something, but they can't afford to do it, okay? So for example, when it comes to the developed countries, cold storage for horticultural crops is standard. Cold storage, application of like ethylene management technologies, this is standard practice. But for smallholder farmers in Africa, it's not standard practice because a cold room is way out of reach for most of the smallholder farmers. And you realize that most of our production, of our horticultural production, is for domestic market and a bit of it for export. So you have, horticultural crops are highly perishable. Without a functional system, without proper storage on farm, it means that a lot will be wasted at the farm because they harvest and they cannot store. There's no cold chain, as we call it in horticulture. So for us, what we're trying to do is, like I said earlier, is there affordable? Are there alternatives to conventional cold room, for example? So if I delve a little bit into what you're doing with the support from the Rockefeller Foundation is to bring some of these innovations, like evaporative cooling. Evaporative cooling is not new, it's old technology, but farmers are not aware, okay? So what
Could you describe the technology, please?
So evaporative cooling basically is, you evaporate water from a medium. So we have charcoal. For example, what you're trying to promote is charcoal cooler. When you wet the charcoal and hot air passes through the wet charcoal, cool air comes on the other side. So this is very simple. So we have charcoal cooler. We have another evaporative cooling technology called the zero energy cool chamber, which is made from bricks. This is pretty affordable, at least for the smallholder farmers. So this is not high-tech. But again, looking at affordability and suitability for rural farmers in Africa, where electricity is a challenge. So this for us is appropriate technology. But how do we make the farmers aware of its effectiveness? So we've done on-station research. So we go to the farmers with evidence that this is how it works, this is how well it works. So that is for the cooling, evaporative cooling. But also one other technology which is an innovation coming from the US which was being promoted by the UC Davis, the CUBOT technology. Again, another very low cost compared to conventional cold room. So you have this costing less than a quarter of the price of a similar cold room, but can actually give you the, the coolness, the cooling capacity as a conventional cold room. So these are for us what you're trying to see. Okay, fine, technologies are there. How do we get them to the farmers? So what we have done recently is to bring all these technologies together in what we're calling smallholder aggregation centers. So what we are doing in these aggregation centers is to demonstrate on farm, because a lot of what we do research is in our universities, in our research institutions, where farmers cannot see practically how this works. So, but with aggregation centers, we can actually show. So for what we've done is to establish pilot one, a smallholder aggregation center where we have all these technologies, not only for storage, but for small scale processing. So when farmers, aggregate produce, first of all, we are working with farmers in groups. Because smallholder farmer in Africa, we're talking about less than 2 acres. It's just so little produce, yeah? But I can't tell one farmer to build a cold room because it doesn't make sense. But when farmers are aggregated in groups, then you can actually have these facilities shared among the groups of farmers. So they can store this produce, aggregate, get quantity, that, can sell to the traders who wouldn't otherwise come to pick little volumes of produce. But then also at this aggregation center, we have designed it in a way that whatever is not sold fresh, without cold storage, usually would go to waste. But whatever is not sold can be processed. Can be processed into juices, can be processed into dry products, so that, farmers are not forced to sell. Like I think initially my other colleagues had discussed that for smallholder farmers in Kenya, let me say I'm from Kenya, but in Africa generally, it's not that they can't produce it. They can't produce, okay? But then when they produce, for example, let's say for mango. Mango is my favorite fruit. Mango is one of the major fruits we produce in Kenya. But again, the wastage in mango, we're talking about upwards of 50%. Every season. And that is when those losses means lost income for the farmers. So how can you help these farmers make more? So because the mango would retail in Kenya, mango retail for 3 cents, 3 US cents when the mango is in season. Wow. Yeah? The same mango, when it moves from the farm, some logistics, somebody has transported, gotten it to the city, it goes for upwards of 60 cents. That's like 20 times more, yes? So people are doing the logistics and making money, but the farmers are not making money. So they're not going to earn a living out of growing mangoes if they're not empowered. And empowering is about them having access to market, having the right quantities, which they can sell to traders who then sell to the market in the city or to the exporters. So that is the little effort we're trying to do to empower farmers to attain the quality and the quantity and the consistency that is required for them to access market.
Thank you so much. That's amazing.
I think I'd like to follow up on that just by saying, you had mentioned something earlier when you were talking about this in terms of when you're saying at scale. I just want to really clarify that we feed this world with 70% small landholder farming, not the opposite. Mm-hmm. And that what we're talking about, whether we're in New York or we're in Kenya, that this small-scale infrastructure for farmers to work together to provide this food and to provide bioregional systems that are not attached to a resource input system like we have in place is necessary as we look ahead and kind of anticipate the change that's coming. So I think that's one of the biggest parts of this, is that we have, especially, well, everywhere, I suppose, because we've had this false sense of some agricultural system going to take care of us outside of the rest of nature, that agriculture and conservation are separate things from each other, and that community is not necessarily needing to be connected to this whole thing. That's where we need to get people back connected, because this emergency that just went off on our phones here could be a food shortage. Mm-hmm. We're talking about something where this is something that we can actually engage in and enjoy and find the pleasure in community again by reconnecting to that. And when we understand that more, we might understand the service of a chicken rather than trying to figure out in the end how to be so efficient with it. What does it do for us? Why do we even have that in our system in the first place? And how does that contribute to the conservation of this planet for the betterment of our whole? And so I think that's a really important thing that all of us are dealing with globally.
Yeah. Food, I think food is traveling longer distance than we ever imagined. There's more urbanization happening. We cannot deny that fact. So how can we find ways to bring mangoes from Africa to the consumer markets? I think we have several examples. Today, if you think about it, fish is exported from Chile to the US by plane. We, consumers in the US, pay for the salmon that comes from Chile for that very expensive supply chain. Now, if we were to ship that by ships, in a very efficient manner, keeping fish fresh, there's a solution out there. So I think there are many examples that we can, as an industry, look at how we can bring mangoes and many other produce to consumers in a much more efficient way and to help the small farmers, which are the ones that suffer most.
Beth, and then we'll turn to Maria.
Sure. Yeah, just wanted to add to a couple of the recent comments. The CUBOT technology that Jain mentioned actually was developed by a smallholder, small farm in New England, who recognized that he needed a cold room to keep his farm produce fresh, and developed this simple technology to hook up with a standard air conditioner unit. And now, through some of our educational programs, it's spread to the world, really, and is a great technology, I believe. The point that Jain made about the crop losses in many parts of the world, Kenya is one example, is really important because the lack of cold chain and the inability to move the needle forward in terms of installing some sort of a cold chain in many parts of the world, and not just cold chain, but also dry chain. So we have products that are dried and intended to be stored stable and dry, but then are stored in jute sacks exposed to high humidity or rainfall, and we get, toxins developing and a lot of mold and product losses for a lot of the staples. So the losses that occur, the magnitude of losses due to lack of cold chain and dry chain are really astounding, and I think we do need to start having that conversation about how do we, continuing on from the wonderful stuff that Jain is doing, how do we really start to move that and get these things to become more standard practice?
Thank you.
I think it's a real issue that most smallholder farmers around the world are not paid to the extent that they should be for their products.
Yes.
And we really, in this part of the world, I speak about Europe, I speak about the US, I mean, we really need to think through the immense pressure that we've had for cheap food. I mean, clearly, it's the blessing and the curse to have cheap food, and many people need cheap food. But the fact of the matter is that this desire for cheap food that many of us can afford to pay more for has contributed to a monoculture that is detrimental to our environment. It has contributed to nutritional value disappearing out of these crops because the only thing we've been thinking about is yields. And we have ended up in a situation where 12 crops contribute to 75% of the food we eat globally, where 4 crops actually contribute to 60% of calorie intake in the world. So, we need to diversify our food system. And I am absolutely convinced that a diversification of the food system will contribute to better health for each one of us. It will contribute to a much more sustainable and resilient agriculture, and it will definitely also contribute to decent income to farmers. Without decent income to farmers, we're lost, all of us.
Absolutely.
Can I make a final point before we go to Q&A?
Yes, and I have one last question after that, and then we'll take audience questions. Thank you.
You know, Jain keeps reminding us and other partners as well that, you know, yes, the technology is important, but at the end of the day, you need to go beyond the technology. You need not only the hardware, but the software and the hardware. Meaning, you know, you require the software in terms of just putting these different pieces together and the leadership of the different players on the supply chain for this to work. So I don't want us also to keep, yes, it's really nice to talk about technologies, but I think we have to talk about the ecosystem requires for this to work.
Yeah, and sort of with that, I'd like to turn to Jack for one more question before we turn to the audience of, are there some ways that being more conscious of biodiversity and soil health and the entire ecosystem that farmers operate within to improve not only farmer livelihoods, but also to address issues of food loss and food waste and hunger?
Well, I believe that if we really looked at what farmers are doing on this landscape now, we're really, if you look at the US, we're talking about 1/3 of 1% people farming, which is, you know, amazing to think about that small a number. But these are people that are actually caring for land. In the best case scenario are the ones that are the stewards of this land, in a way connected to conservation. The fact that we don't value that aspect, that we don't value the carbon sequestration and the water filtration and these things. We focus on subsidization programs, but we're not focusing on the values of the things that are actually being saved and conserved. Clean water and organic soils and carbon sinks and habitats, things like that. This is a big part of it, because if we actually were concluding that in the values of everything that was there, we would likely have more farmers functioning around cities and producing more. So in terms of food loss, we've redirected that because of this kind of cooked book of an agricultural system that doesn't actually value the resource conservation, or the loss of resources, and the non-renewable resources that it takes to operate it. So I believe that's a direct relationship to hunger, and because it's disempowered the farmers and communities that had for so long sustained themselves.
Thank you. With that, I'd love to open it up to you all for some questions for our panelists. Could we get some lights and some microphones, please? We've got somebody right here in the front. Oh, there was somebody front center.
Based on what you've seen, doesn't it make more sense to try to aggregate all of those farmers that have all that access, and instead of talking about changing our perception and changing the way we think and changing the way we do everything, just to put people like this young lady who takes that salvaged produce and makes juice from it, and merely connecting that farmer who would otherwise not pick that food to then say, hey, we have a resource for you, and just create a link so that they can be connected?
That was the point I was making earlier, and you referred to it as well about the connectivity. So we need to be mindful about those opportunities. If we change our mindset to the pursuit of reduction of food waste and loss, you're going to see those opportunities come by. So we need to talk more about mangoes. We need to talk more about other fruits. We need to talk about fish and proteins in general, so we can see where that inefficiency. And the farmer that was referenced here before, the farmer is the biggest risk taker. I mean, think about it. The time of decision of planting to the time of harvesting, the amount of money that's employed, the risk that's taken related to weather, to economic conditions, to pricing, time to market, or accessibility to market. Those are the things that I think we can collectively pursue, but thinking about food waste as the background, but the forefront of our ideas. We'll find lots of opportunities, I would say.
Yeah, and there are some good examples already. There's a program in San Francisco, for example, called Imperfect Produce that goes out and collects unwanted or unusable produce from farms, and then they distribute it like in CSA boxes or whatever. Unfortunately, it's not a large footprint that they're distributing to, but if this sort of thing grows, and I'm sure there are lots of examples in other parts of the country, and in fact, I think we're going to hear about some of this a little bit later today, but we just need to continue to grow those opportunities to make it easy. You know, as you said, farming is challenging. It's also, you know, farmers work from sun up to sundown and then beyond. So, you know, I think we just need to make it easier for them to do the right thing by providing connections.
Somebody behind.
Hi, thank you. In talking about food tech and the element of still having the human element, we know that farmers are aging out, talking about sustainability. Do you see a pathway for like youth workforce empowerment where we can use, I like to call them mixed use spaces. So I'm empowering youth to use soil-based and soil-less technologies, whereas in year-round. So I'm very agnostic to how they get it done as long as my community gets access and equity to food. So that's kind of the vein of my question, comment.
I'll take a shot at that, at least to start anyway. First, I think that is the key, getting in young, getting on the ground young, and getting this to be exciting, part of our food system, part of how we eat and we come together. When we're 16 and 17 and 18 and we're just making that realization that the world has betrayed us a bit, we're just learning about what's happening, it's a great time to start to farm. That's when I chose my path to direct myself, because I realized what was actually going on, and it wasn't this storybook. I think that's a critical moment. I'll say that one thing that we've done at Stone Barns is develop a curriculum for junior and senior high school kids that is 4 high schools around the country to use as curriculum to tie in. That's helping go over social and ecological and yes, because it's all a part of what's happening. This is modern, this is technology, this is cultural, this is our future together. We can fix this, we can adjust this. So I think it's really important for the youth to engage in this and to lead this forward. It's our call. And yeah, I think that it is about engaging everybody and getting people reconnected. Because how many of us are spending much time on farms? And really, we're talking about this, but what are we seeing? I mean, I've spent my life in farming. I spent my morning in the sweet potatoes. I saw 3 inches of rain last night and what it did to my corn, what it's doing for my sweet potatoes. We need to have that contact, and we need to bring it home, and we need to eat it together, and we need to talk about it, and we need to make change that way.
The younger generations typically don't want to continue their farming business after their parents. This is a big issue. That's why I mentioned earlier about Future Farmers of America. We need to create this importance and give the proper importance to farmers. And the young people, I think they're getting this more. I think there's connectivity that's helping us on that direction, but it's still a big issue.
And we have the same challenge in Africa and other parts of the developing world where the youth are leaving the farms to go to the cities because farming is viewed as drudgery. We have some programs we're doing. One in Guinea, for example, we have a youth-led horticulture training center where Avenires are training. They're learning how to produce technologies, horticultural technologies, and now they're marketing those to the growers in the region. So they're becoming entrepreneurs, but they're also trying to get people excited about farming again.
We just have a minute left. I'd like to take one more question in the back if we can.
Hi, I'm from Chile, and we have a very big rural population that does farming. And I kind of want to know what alternatives do you guys know or use for prolonging harvesting life in fruits and vegetables, and that are also sustainable, because it's very hard for us to have maybe a cold chamber or use a lot of plastic for wrapping fruit so that it will last longer? What sustainable alternatives do you guys see or have studied?
I can give you one example. In avocados, there's a lot of waste on that. We as consumers, we get an avocado, cut it in half, eat half, the other half tends to spoil, and we throw it away. We've done that, I've done that. So through better systems where you can effectively connect the producer to a processor that's going to take the entire production and have single portion packs, bring to market without waste and losses, there is a way to do it. That happens today. We've done this in Australia, with, in New Zealand, I'm sorry, with avocado producers there, and it's been successful. So there are ways to do it.
Very quickly, we're out of time.
No, please go ahead. No, it's all right.
Okay. Well, I would like to throw my panelists under the bus and offer for you to come and find them afterwards. This has been a really amazing discussion. Thank you all so much for having us.
Thank you.